Hi, welcome to Main Street Books Virtual Outpost. It's actually Main Street Books. We're here in Davidson, North Carolina, and I am so delighted to have this group of people come from all corners, I think. I'll be interested to hear where everyone is. But I'm Ada Fitzgerald. I'm proprietor here at Main Street Books in Davidson, North Carolina. And as an indie bookstore owner, I am so appreciative of those of you who've taken some time to get on Zoom, probably for the third or fourth time today, and experience with us what we consider to be one of the critical parts of our mission, which is to bring together people in conversation around books. And in addition, we really appreciate your support for this small, local, independent business. So thank you so much for your intentionality today. We appreciate it. Now, about tonight's book. Makenna Goodman aimed a dagger at my heart with this one. Partway through this book, I wasn't really sure if I could trust her to resist jabbing and twisting it. It really hit home. I spent some years in a previous pre-bookstore life, backyard homesteading, or my own version of it. A lot of it was armchair homesteading, but there were chickens. There was a cooperative neighborhood garden. There were rain barrels. And I also found myself very attached to a certain set of bloggers that I found that eventually became Instagrammers. And so truly, I cannot tell you how seen I felt in this book. And I won't go any further. I'm still here. My heart is still intact because I want Makenna to really be the one to talk about this book. But I will say that if you have even momentarily fantasized about backyard chickens, or find yourself spending a little more time than you'd like to admit following someone on Instagram, this is the book for you. Makenna Goodman is the author of The Shame, which was named a Literary Hub recommended read for August 2020 and a Bustle most anticipated read for August 2020. Her words and work have been featured in the Paris Review, Electric Literature, Guernica, Literary Hub, Catapult, The Rumpus, the Adroit Journal, and others. Joining her tonight is our friend, Mary Laura Philpott, Davidson alum, and also fellow bookseller, book recommender out in the independent bookstore world. Mary Laura is the author of the nationally best-selling memoir and essays, I Miss You When I Blink. Her essays, or her work, is also featured frequently by the New York Times and other publications. Thank you all for being here. Before you take the mic, Makenna, I want to invite our events manager, Beth Helfrich, in to give us some housekeeping instructions before we let Mary Laura and Makenna take the spotlight.
Awesome. Thanks, Ada. And Ada, if you can keep an eye on the waiting room so we don't leave anybody hanging, that would be awesome. So thrilled that you all are here. For the bulk of the conversation, which is going to happen momentarily, we are going to ask that if you are not Mary Laura or Makenna, if you could please turn your video off. That will help highlight their faces for everybody else. And I'm going to keep the chat open. We would love your comments and questions as they're talking. After they chat for a little bit, I'll hop back in and present some of your questions to them as well. After the Q&A, we will start the signing process. Makenna is ready to personalize copies of The Shame for you via her book plates. So I'll be back with further instructions about that. But in the meanwhile, sit back, enjoy this riveting conversation, and we're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Ada. This is so fun. All right, Makenna, while we get settled and everybody's turning off their video, tell us, since we're not in the same room as we would normally be at a book tour event, where are you joining us from?
A small village in Vermont, and I'm in my studio right now. So my kids and my husband are in a different dwelling far away. And if anyone here, not that far, but if for some reason my phone rings, we're having some phone issues. And so I will just, it's been doing that. I don't know, Mercury's in retrograde or something. I have no idea. But,
How long,
so yeah,
how long have you lived in Vermont?
I have been here for over a decade. So 11 or 12 years, I can't remember now. But yeah, I've been here for a long part of my life, certainly.
What brought you there, and where were you before?
I was in New York City, as a matter of fact. I was working in publishing, and it was 2008. And so it was a moment of, you know, financial instability in the city. But regardless of that, I was ready to go. And I knew I had community in this area of Vermont because I had attended a semester program as a high school student here. So yeah, I followed my heart and never left.
I love it. Well, Ada put it so much more eloquently than I would when she said you put a dagger in her heart. I was telling you in the virtual green room before we got started that what I wanted to do with this book is grind it up into oatmeal and eat it. I love this book. I mean, I love it from the outside in. I love the French flaps. Milkweed makes such beautiful, beautiful books. And I fell in love with this in the first two paragraphs, and I was sold. I just adore it. Would you mind giving us, just for the folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet, kind of your fourth grade book report version of my name is Makenna and this is my book and what is it about? Who do we have here?
Well, here it is, The Shame. So the book it takes place over the course of one day, really, over, 24 hours, give or take, in a woman's life. Her name is Alma, and the book begins with her in the car driving away from her family in the middle of the night. You discover as she's driving in the dark what brought her to this moment as she pieces together recollections of her life and of her sort of existential journey. And you discover that she is a mother of two young children. Her husband's a philosophy professor. They live a very ethically integrated life on the land where they have, chickens and sheep and raise a lot of their own food and live very close to their belief system. But she feels isolated and lonely and can't integrate her intellectual life with her life as a mother and her life on the land, and everything's very disparate and detached and integrated. And she finds solace in books that she reads late at night after everyone's asleep by women writers who begin to be her lens into this possible world. And they're not contemporary necessarily. The writers are from 100, 200 years before, give or take. And basically she decides that in order to manifest this feeling of community that she's gained through her reading life, she must write a book to join these women in conversation. And in order to write a book, she decides she's going to figure out her life at the same time. So she's going to write a book about her own journey, but she has to find a woman to use as a model for character development that isn't herself. And so she discovers this woman, Celeste, online and develops a fixation on her and loses her way creatively. And so the book is really about, a lot of different things, which we can talk about, but in general, it is an escape fantasy, and it's a road trip. It's this idea of going a far distance to try and find oneself when perhaps the journey is a misguided one.
That's perfectly put. So my dilemma, having worked as a bookseller for several years until recently, and still kind of working in the book hustle adjacent world, is after I read this and I adored it and I wanted everyone I knew to read it, the first thing I thought was, I'm going to put a picture of this on my Instagram and I'm going to rave about it. And then I thought, oh my God,
right.
This, part of your whole story about the story that you tell is a way of engaging in important questions about life's meaning and about creative work and the difference between what's real and what's artificial. It's the story of this woman getting caught up in the artifice of Instagram. And so then I was like, well, should I not post it? Like, should I have a phone tree? How should I tell people? So I'm wondering, like, here as you're, on book tour, how do you reconcile the business side of selling your art with the creative side of making your art and all the things that you write about in here? How has that felt to be on tour, virtual tour as it is for The Shame?
Well, it's interesting. I never call it Instagram, actually. It's funny. People sort of choose what social media
That's true.
think is. And I was careful not to do that because, and I'm happy that you said Instagram. I'm happy that you said that because I think it reminds me that what drew me to tell this story was a question of how the human psyche works and how the human psyche imprints or projects onto objects, onto ideas, onto people, and how social media / the internet in general offers this kind of curated landscape that's perfectly primed for our projections that we see as information, as a vast world of possibility. And yet, in fact, it's like we're in a dark room and surrounded by pitch black night. And we know that, there are 4 walls, but we don't quite know how to get out. And all of a sudden we see the outline, the golden outline of a door, and we see the door is there, and we open the door and we go into the light. But what we don't realize is we're just entering into another dark room that's light for just a brief moment. And I see the internet as this compelling place where we can throw ourselves and think anything is possible. But in reality, we dictate what we see. We look for what we want to see. And in a sense, I think that we're looking for ourselves. And we're the journey that we take to find it says more about who we are than perhaps what we're lacking or what we're looking for. Anyway, and in terms of selling, so to me, I think, well, humans have done that forever.
Right.
I would say that's sort of the hallmark of human consciousness, is the ability to say, this is me and this is you. Right. And this is our world, to kind of create a concept around something. So the internet is this interesting performance space. It's like the stage. We're all surrounded in a circle, but we're all watching it from different angles and different dramas. Anyway, so in terms of, I've already lost track of your question, but in terms of selling a book that is about the difference between art that inspires a transformation of the self versus art that serves commerce. And that's another thing I didn't mention in the plot, is that at the same time that this woman who's sort of trapped by her choices, trapped by her privilege to be able to say, I choose to be a stay-at-home mother, I choose to raise a lot of my own food, even though it's harder than going to the store and buying it. And she becomes trapped by that. She also traps herself in this idea that, or she becomes entrapped in this idea that there is an art that can free her, that it can answer all of her questions, but it's a very specific type of art. And at the same time, she's offered an opportunity, with a decent, sizable paycheck, to write basically marketing copy for a toy company about nature, basically. And she's grappling with, well, what should I do? Because, like, on the one hand, this is meaningful art, writing this novel. And on the other hand, this is art with no meaning. And I think that, to me, I think about that a lot. And I wonder, at what point are these choices really manifestations? I don't know. And so to want to sell something that is about the the like paradox in that question is weird. But to me, I don't really think of it as selling because I have a great publisher that's a nonprofit press. So they don't, they don't want me to say, don't buy the book, but they don't. Theirs is Milkweed Editions. It's this fabulous nonprofit press in Minneapolis. and their goal is to further a conversation in literature and to bring like a greater sense of like depth and access to literature and literacy. Anyway, so I think if I had a big 5 publisher who was saying, get thee on Target, on Costco shelves, it might be different.
Yeah.
So I don't really have to sell myself. I just get to chat with brilliant people like you.
Yeah. Well, you are very well paired with your publisher. They're wonderful. And it's, you know, you have booksellers who can do the selling, you know, booksellers who can go out and actually like do the matchmaking of giving the book to people. For most of the book, as you mentioned, Alma is driving from Vermont to New York, and most of what we read are her thoughts or her memories as she drives. And one of the things she replays in her mind is this dinner party where she's with her husband, who is an academic, and some other people from the college and their spouses. And she's a little nervous going into the dinner party. She wants to make a good impression, but she puts a lot of care into preparing, and she starts to feel kind of confident about it. And this was the scene. I knew 2 paragraphs into the book that I loved this book, but this was the scene where I thought, I'm going to go buy 20 copies and give this to every woman I know. Would you mind reading a little bit of that dinner scene for us?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So her husband this is very early on in the book, 20 pages in, and her husband has just been awarded tenure, and they're going to the celebratory dinner. And this is right in where she realizes where she has been placed at the table. She's worried, she's preparing, and she realizes her name tag is next to the president of the college, and she realizes this is her moment. So they're talking, drinking wine. Yes, I was winning them all over. Our discussion was the perfect combination of agreeability and combativeness. The salad came and went. I challenged conservative assertions in just the right tone and could see I made some of the wives stop and think when discussing the merits of public versus private education. What was a better choice, blessing the under-resourced public school with your presence and thinking that was enough to address the problems of segregation, or creating a radical, inexpensive, non-dogmatic private school to show the public sector their model wasn't working and give them an example of one that might? We spoke of hunting and the politics of ecological agriculture. And I went on for some time about nutrient density and the difference between merely organic food and that which is deeply nourishing on a micronutrient level. There is a big difference. A carrot is not just a carrot. At my suggestion, we even played the "which dessert are you" personality game, my favorite, a gamble to be sure, but it went over really well. Everyone was so relaxed. I was a breath of fresh air to them, you could tell. I wasn't faking this, mind you. Yes, I'd had to read some back issues, but they had always been around. I was the one who had subscribed to them in the first place. A lot of this was, in fact, my area of interest. And while I might not have had success in the world of the written word, I wasn't a pudding, though in the dessert game, of course, I was. This was an important exercise for me, knowing that I still had a brain. I still had something to give. I began to feel as if I, too, had been offered the promotion. Asa's boss, the president, chocolate person, very picky, laughed with me about something, elbowing me in the arm as if we had known each other since the good old days. And the wife of the chair of the medieval studies department invited me to a private meditation group at her guest house on Sunday mornings. She was a classic pie person, and we found out all about her top secret recipe for the flakiest crust, something pie people always do, try to convert you. I had another glass of wine. The conversation kept flowing. I could have stayed all night. Everyone was focused on me, amazed at how much I knew, considering I wasn't a professional woman, how I was the only stay-at-home mom at the table who didn't hire someone to clean her house, who gardened, who raised sheep, who dabbled in freelance work, who was an artist, who knew that painting is not just drawing with paint, but the placement of color next to color, who had time to read long-form journalism while taking care of 2 kids and making dinner every night, sewing patches on pants instead of buying new pairs. I could see a glimmer of envy in the other wives' faces when I discussed the projects and nature hikes I organized for my kids, the forts we'd built, that they used real knives to cut real vegetables. Yes, eyes were on me. And my audience was speechless, it seemed, as I digressed and divulged exactly how to make sauerkraut. It's all about process, but it's actually quite simple. After a while, I discovered that yes, while all eyes were on me, the interest and admiration in the other wives' eyes didn't seem right exactly. Could it be that it was closer to horror? What had I said? Oh shit. Had I said something wrong? Had I joked about homeschoolers in a pejorative way, not knowing that someone's cousins were unschooling their kids on a nearby farm? I hadn't brought up vaccinations or astrology. Oh God, had I? And then the head of admissions, who was sitting directly across from me, stifled a laugh. And as he covered his mouth, his wife, cake person, sugar fiend, slapped him on the shoulder. I took a breath and reached for my water glass to buy some time to slow down and regroup. But my hands, I found, were occupied. Distracted by my own pontificating, I had been, for who knows how long, but clearly long enough, cutting the president's filet mignon. And when I looked down at his plate, I could see that I had done a very good job indeed. The pieces were spaced evenly apart and in neatly arranged cubes, just large enough to spear with a fork, but not too big to choke on.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love that scene so much. I mean, there's so much I want to say, I don't even know where to start. This book is such a perfect read for like an English major type who loves a book that functions on many levels. You can study that scene and take it apart. And one of the things that fascinates me about this book is it's really short. You are so efficient. It does so much heavy lifting in so few pages. And then you have these scenes like this one that just sort of blossom and bloom. And it's almost like it's defying the laws of space, that it can be that short and have these detailed, fantastic scenes. Can you tell us a little bit about your process of, I don't know if you write longer and then you whittle down or how you do it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think for this book in particular, a lot of it was, I was just describing this to someone who interviewed me today, and it was really valuable to think about how I wrote this book actually in phases. And the first phase was in response to, I didn't set out to write a novel. I didn't say, I'm going to write a novel that's going to be short and it's going to, be this tone. And I really came into it from an intuitive place in the sense that I was feeling lost. I was feeling confused. I had just had my second child. I was on maternity leave and I was walking a lot and talking a lot to myself and very confused by the pieces of my life and not being able to fit them together. And the way that I deal with that is by talking to myself while on walks.
Same.
And at the time I was doing a lot of reading about matriarchal cultures and the kind of goddess throughout kind of literature and just narratives in general, historical narratives, creation myths, etc. And I was given to them by an astrologer who I had seen, who was incredibly intellectual and interesting. And we were talking a lot about mythology. And one of the books she gave me was this book from the 1980s, which was psychoanalytic theory, Jungian psychoanalytic theory, where this, and also a tiny book, but for me really blew open this important door. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the guy. I feel like I'm always talking about this guy's book. I don't even want to name it, but what it did was it opened up the possibility. What he said was the Eros and Psyche myth, which is this classical Greek myth that's, interpreted often as a woman competing with her mother-in-law for the love of this man, the god of love. And he said, no, in fact, the myth could be seen as a series of projections. And then in fact, each character in the myth is the woman manifested in different projections. So she was every character. And when I saw him break the myth down, character by character, plot point by plot point, into a narrative structure that freed the woman in question, this archetypal woman, whatever that means, freed her by taking her out of any one role and giving her all of the roles. All of a sudden, my life just completely made sense. All of the existential questions that I was thinking about that seemed to have no relation to one another, the things I was doing in my life that felt really meaningful but fraught and paradoxical and juxtaposed, made no sense. All of a sudden I realized that actually all of life, all of being and becoming and awareness is about busting up against brick wall after brick wall in yourself. So I created, at the time this was 5 years ago when I wrote the first draft, and I was horrified by how social media and the internet seem to become advertising through my friends into the language of friendship. And I was barely on social media as it was. And yet I would lurk and I would look and I would just be horrified by how, you know, people would brag about the things they had when what they really wanted to say, it seemed to me, was how sad they were and how lost they were. And then the interpreter would interpret the bragging as a feeling of, oh, I don't have something. So it just was like this shame cycle, this shame spiral of whatever, like fake community, just fake, I don't know. It just was so, but I was fixated on like, what is this thing? What is the internet? What is social media? Looking at it from under a microscope. And I was just recently reading Deleuze, who's like a French philosopher, and he was talking about how, basically, this is a little bit of a digression, but it's important to me. So I hope that's okay. But he was a very important philosopher, but he spent most of his life in Paris, and he wrote about philosophy all across the world. And at one point there was a critic who said, yes, but you were born in Paris and you lived your whole life in Paris. I mean, I don't know if it's a whole life, but like, how could you speak about the whole world, you know? And he said, if I stick where I am, I wrote this down. If I stick where I am, if I don't travel around like anyone else, I make my inner journeys that I can only measure by my emotions and express very obliquely and circuitously when I write. Arguments from one's own privileged experience are bad and reactionary arguments. And he said, instead of asking, is it true, or what is it? He says, asking about the larger question in a practical application, how does it work? And when I started, to me, this just distilled how I've been thinking this whole time in a way that I keep saying, oh, it was intuitive, or it was this and that. But it's like, how does it work? Instead of looking at something as a problem, looking at the functionality of it and how it works has helped me to see what role I play, as opposed to what so often happens, which is taking it upon oneself as, you know, it's because I'm bad, or it's because I'm seeing the world all wrong, or it's because I'm jealous, or it's because I'm ashamed of what I have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Anyway, the first phase of writing it was laying out basically the myth of what I felt my life was at the moment. And then it went out to editors and got a lot of feedback, and it butted up against Commerce.
Yeah.
And Commerce said, basically, this is really interesting and compelling, and we love the writing, and yet we don't know how to sell it because it's too short and it's too weird and it's too whatever, unsaleable. And that really informed a second draft, which was much more about what art was meant to do. If psychoanalytic theory was meant to deconstruct a deep philosophical mythology that was so rooted in my way of being, I didn't even realize what it was. So just naming it. The second draft was about connecting the dots between the act of creating something as a response to that. Then I found a fabulous editor and publisher. And the third draft was really about compression, meaning like, I think about it as like a sculptor who's shaving off.
Taking off what you don't need.
Off.
You've mentioned a couple times the state of being ashamed, and it makes me think about the title. And I was just texting my friend KJ Del Antonia, who lives in New Hampshire, last night. Yeah, we were talking about your book, and she said, ask her about the title. Was it always titled The Shame? How did it end up titled The Shame?
You know, it wasn't always. It came at the very last minute. We were just really struggling for a title for a long time. And I couldn't think of anything. I really couldn't, forever. And no one could. we had one title that I'm not even going to name because I really disliked it. And that was like the contractual title, but it was the only thing that made sense. And I don't know, like I was on the phone with a writer friend and we were talking about, I can't even remember what, but we were talking about the feeling of the idea of envy, the idea of weighing one's life against another life.
Yeah.
And talking about that feeling when you're full of desire and wanting, and how nothing that you have will compare to the thing that someone else has, regardless of how nice the thing it is that you have yourself. And I just said like, it's just the shame. It's the shame, the shame, the shame, the shame. And she was like, you should just call it the shame. Anyway,
It's perfect. It's perfect.
I don't know what the shame is. I think the point is that there's no one shame. Like, I think you could look at it a million different ways in terms of the shame that society puts on women who are ambitious when they're supposed to be domestic, you know?
Yeah. The way I hear it is the way you just said it, the shame. It's like the horror, like just all the shames, the shames.
All of them.
I don't want to hog the conversation. Beth, if you will jump in and let us know if we have audience questions. I have more questions, but if there are things other people want to ask, I want to provide that opportunity.
We do. So Shannon wants to know, you were talking about reading female authors. Who is your favorite, Makenna?
Oh God, I don't have one. I'm sorry. Yeah, there's too many. I couldn't even, it would be so unfair and horrible if I cherry picked one. I mean, I read a lot of women in translation, actually. And I'm currently reading a lot of right now I'm in a different spiral, but I'm looking at my stack of books next to me. But I guess for whatever reason, I'm really attracted to translation and books that were written in the mid 1900s or the earlier 1900s that were rediscovered by an English speaking audience rather recently. Because to me, it feels like this treasure of like a lost history that is only just becoming available. So someone like Natalia Ginsburg, who's an Italian writer, or Annie Ernaux, who is extremely well known in France and yet has just barely started making it to an English reader.
We're gonna have to write those names down.
Yeah, Big Dishorth is amazing. Big Dishorth is my current favorite female, right? Whatever. She's just my favorite writer right now because she's a Norwegian author and she just came out with she only has 3 books translated in English and has written over 30, and she's extremely well regarded in Norway. And I think she just does what I think is the brilliance of good literature, where she manages to make a book easy to read. You're swiftly turning the pages. You can't stop. You're taken up. It's like a coursing river. You're in the river. And yet there's still pockets of air for your own experience to breathe in. And so she manages to take these minute kind of meaningless seeming moments in life and create like a whole philosophy for culture and humanity. And anyway, I love her work.
Okay, you have to tell us. I was trying to frantically look up how to spell this.
Oh yeah,
writer's name. So,
and she's also, I'm writing.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Her question is, can you? Okay, that was not how I spelled yours.
Yeah. And actually, my first book review I've ever written, which it was so fun, and I hope I just get to do many more, was her latest book, Long Live the Post Horn, which just came out. I'll write it in the chat. And it was woefully misunderstood, I believe, by the critical media. Barely covered. It's all about the Postal Service. It's so timely.
Wow.
And it's just genius. And it was written right after the terrorist attacks in Norway in 2012, where the entire nation was completely shattered by this event. It's so timely for where we are right now. Anyway.
Excellent. Shannon had a postscript to her question, which is, have you read The Mists of Avalon?
Oh yeah, I love that book.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's your answer, Shannon.
Are there, McKenna, are there books that you think of as being sort of like book relatives or sort of foremothers or book friends of your book? Like if your book, if you were going to shelve your book with its family tree, its literary relatives, what would you put next to it?
I mean, that to me feels like, how could I answer that question without seeming like a horrifying narcissist? Like,
Yeah. Well,
I
first
mean,
of all, I would put all these people, like I would, if I
Sheila
were shelving
Heti,
it.
I mean, like, if I may, and she's
Yeah.
a friend now. I think Sheila Heti is an absolutely brilliant thinker. And I think, again, her latest book, which is called Motherhood,
Mm-hmm.
might as well have been called Art, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that often people go, oh, motherhood, well, I don't have kids, or I'm not interested in motherhood, and so I shouldn't read that book. But that is a work of philosophical brilliance, I think.
Yeah.
So Sheila, okay, if I'm just going to go out
Do
there
it.
and say, I mean,
Because I made you. I'm making you do it.
I would say Vigdis Hjorth, honestly.
There
I
you
mean,
go.
she's so, I really respect the way that it's interesting because I talk about art for commerce or made by and sold by for the machine versus transformative art. But I also really believe in being entertained. And I think that there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong there. It's not like this, there's a reason why her husband comes from this academic background. It can weigh you down.
Yeah.
Like, it's so impenetrable, the wonk, and I just think that it's such a classist system, actually, academia, and yet there's so much richness in the literature. And I think it's amazing when a writer can bring these larger philosophical questions in an entertaining package that changes
Absolutely.
you. Anyway, I don't know.
Absolutely.
I've been listening to some Susan Sontag interviews lately. I mean, she's brilliant. Okay, Toni Morrison, all the greats. I don't know, like all of them.
I
Virginia
agree.
Woolf.
I would put it next to, in fact, I am going to put it next to my Jenny Offel books.
Oh yeah, she's great too.
I mean, it's going to go right there. I'm going to put it next to Lydia Millett's A Children's Bible.
Oh God, I haven't read that. I should read that.
Oh, McKenna. It has that sort of parable, like you can read the story for just the story, and then you can kind of read it on a parable level and,
cool.
Unwrap it a million different ways. That's where I would put it.
Okay, thanks.
There you go.
All right, we have one more question from Elijah, which is, well, first of all, Elijah says, thank you for this wonderful discussion, and wants to know a little bit more about this idea of motherhood and art. You just referred to the novel called Motherhood, which may as well have been called Art.
Mm-hmm.
But I think especially within the context of your novel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sure. I mean, I think that motherhood is a very crucial form of humanity and labor. Like it's a very undervalued form of labor, I would say. And I think it's often kind of like siloed into this category of like that time in life when, we have to do it, right? Like someone's got to raise the children. And if you can't hire someone to do it, well, then you should do it. And then time will pass and then you'll get back to work or whatever. Like, I think there's this idea that motherhood, is not like a valuable, like profession. It is not, no one is paid to be a mother necessarily, really, at all. And I think it puts women, and I don't think only women can be mothers, but whatever, for the sake of argument, like it puts women in a position where they have to choose, and they have to choose between their children or their career, which is their children or their art or their job. And if you choose your children, then you're virtuous because you've put aside all of your narcissistic ambition or any kind of, you know, you want something from the world. God only knows why you would want that when you have these beautiful children who need you, but you've put that aside and you're taking care of them, and that's virtuous because you're sort of propelling humanity and keeping it going silently and virtuously. Then you have the mother who decides, well, no, I choose my ambition, and that woman is virtuous because she is bucking convention and going out into the world and, you know, getting what's hers, and she's a feminist, and this will all work out. But either way, there's this like underbelly to the virtue, which is, well, you may be a virtuous mother who stayed at home, but come on, you don't have a brain. Or you may be this virtuous woman who's out on the thing, but like, who's raising your kids? You're terrible. They miss you, you know, no one's mothering them. Either way, we're fucked. And I think that it's set up that way. I think that it's designed that way. I think it's designed that way in the same, like, okay, sure, biologically, if you believe that women should nurse their children if they can, and that creates this healthy microbiome and the kid is set up for success, you could argue like 18 different other like debates that are out there about what nurturing is and what any of that is. And anytime you take a stance on a virtue of some way of being, it's always setting up this binary that's filled with contradictions and nuance. We never look at the nuance. We just look at the reduction. And, you know, I read this book. This is another book I really, really love and recommend that everybody reads. And it's tiny. And it's called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. And it's actually an essay that was published by the feminist press in the, I don't know, 70s or 80s maybe. And it's Barbara Ehrenreich. And I think she had a co-author named Deirdre English. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But what they did was they researched the medical, the institution of medicine, and basically traced it back to the Middle Ages when women were the doctors. They were the healers. They were the midwives. They were in control of illness and birth. They had the knowledge. And there was a systematic, basically eradication of women, of like to the tune of millions of women burned at the stake and killed because they had too much power. And this was the king's decision, you know, this sort of like group of kings. And that was the time when medical school was created for men only. And that was the moment where it was that if you wanted to be legitimized in the medical profession, you had to be a man. That was a prerequisite. And then it, you know, it built from there. And now I think less so, more and more, but for so long in the very not so distant past, it's been this idea that like, well, there's more men that are doctors because, you know, I don't know, men are just better and they're smarter and they're better at that kind of stuff. This is what children are grown up kind of embedded in their consciousness. And yet it was a systematic like dethroning of women's power. And I think that motherhood as a trope is in a similar space where women are disempowered regardless of what they choose. And the social structures do not support a nuanced parenting structure. So I think that, okay, so that's a long tirade, but I would say the second part of that is that so often when a woman writer writes about motherhood, it's instantly a book for women, by women, about women, that's born one other than anyone who's had a child. Full stop. And I think that's really a problem because motherhood is just another state of being human that everybody can relate to because everyone has either been mothered or they haven't been mothered and they've wanted to be mothered. And we all understand what that's about. And what happens is we categorize these books into motherhood as a subcategory. You know, there's no fatherhood book. No one's like, oh yes, Rabbit Run, right? That was a great fatherhood.
Books for dads.
Yeah, like we loved that. It was great. He left his family. Only dads will love that book. It's like, no, everyone reads Rabbit Run and no one even remembers that it's a book about fatherhood because fatherhood is seen as just the norm of humanity, right? And so every time we talk about a motherhood book or this and that, and that's why Sheila Heti's book was called Motherhood, I think, because it'll stand the test of time in that way. It is just another way of disempowering women artists and women.
Amen, amen, amen.
I mean, to be honest, I will say one last thing about that. A mother who, okay, there's this book I read recently that I love. Here's another, this is like going back to a different question, and I'll put her name in the chat because it's complicated to pronounce. A French
Yes, please
writer,
help us out here.
Amélie Nothomb, I think is how you pronounce it. And she wrote a book called Strike Your Heart, which was about, basically told in a similar like fable, like fairy tale way, about a woman who has 3 children, and her first child, she completely rejects, like completely. And the child is totally screwed up as a result. The second child, she completely smothers with love. And that child is screwed up as a result of being completely smothered. And the third child she treats with balance, and that child's also screwed up. And so I think the point is like, it doesn't actually matter how you're mothered. It is human nature to reject one's mother and move away from, like a bird pushes the baby bird out of the nest. It's human nature. And it's also socialized, I think, in children to rebel against their mothers, partially because we want to identify with them. And how can you identify with something that has been so socially bankrupted? It's painful for children, I think.
Yep.
Whew. All these tensions are certainly speaking to me right now. One quick question that was a follow-up from Elijah, which is, have you read Catherine Nürnberger's Rue?
No.
Collection of poetry. Elijah just says, this part of the discussion makes me think of her poetry collection. So yes, there are several requests. We will pull together a list and send it out to everybody. And we may be able to curate a little display in the shop too. This feels really important. Oh, there's an article now in the chat too. Cool, thanks, Chris. Mary Laura, do you have any other lasting questions before we bring everybody back into the room?
No, I want to let everybody have a chance to get their book signed, but thank you for having me. This is wonderful. Makenna, I wish we could be together in the same room in person so I could just scream in your ear how much I love this book. But thank you for letting me do it like this.
One of the things that I wanted to just quickly say about Mary Laura, even though maybe she's gone. Oh no,
she's still there.
Well, I think humor is a really interesting, and your book, your essays really make me laugh. And I think that, I don't know, I just wanted to say thank you for that. There's nothing better than a good laugh that has an intellectual foundation. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And